in a way, it was a horrible time because we went through all sorts of completely rubbish stuff. But he was a brilliant leader to work with. I think in large organizations where you've got that partnership between, the senior leader and the internal comms person, and being able to work with a leader whose motto was tell it as it is, who genuinely cared about what people thought, who valued my opinion, who trusted my opinion, and it was a partnership between us. That was brilliant.
In this episode, I speak to Sue Dewhurst. Sue has been head of communications at such companies as Barclay's Bank, the Royal Mail and NTL before it became Virgin Media. A new edition of her book, Successful Employee Communications, has been released, and you can see a link to that in the show notes for this episode. Sue's internal communications training course has been taken by over 6,000 people. She says she's interested in how the brain works, what makes people tick, and has a love of cats. Let's get into my conversation with Sue. I understand that you love cats.
I do love cats. As it happens, I'm sitting here in the foster room of our cat, Charlie. I had to shut him outside the door. He was being very noisy.
Was he? So fostering cats, how long have you done that for?
Did it for, goodness me, about 7 years, 8 years, something like that.
And why?
I've just always been a cat lady, to be honest. And we lost a kitten of our own. It died of this awful, horrendous disease that I'd never even heard of. And it was contagious, and it meant that we couldn't get another cat in case it infected our existing cat. And so I spent all my time kind of looking at the local RSPCA website, wanting to adopt cats and not being able to. So I gave them money instead and got to know them really. And in the end, they said, why don't you foster for us? So started fostering for the local RSPCA. It's been fantastic. I've seen kittens born. It's been sad, you hear the sad stories as well, but it's been an amazing thing.
So cats are notoriously standoffish from their owners. Mm-hmm. How does that jive with you as someone who is a communicator and wants to engage with other people regularly, presumably?
I like cats because I always think dogs, you can say and do whatever you like, but a dog's always going to come to you, isn't it? A dog's like, oh, hurrah, lovely, it's you, breakfast, walks, whatever. Whereas a cat's going to choose whether or not it does. So I kind of like the fact that you've got to know how to engage with a cat, or you've got to make that connection for them to come to you. Although oddly enough, cats will often come to the person that does want to communicate with them because they don't like eye contact. But I like that whole thing of trying to understand how to communicate with the cat, really, how to, put your hand out to them so that it's kind of like saying, as a cat would say hello, letting them sniff your hand, and they'll kind of give you the signal whether it's okay to come towards them or not. And I just find it quite interesting, really.
Okay, so tell me about the time that you first really got interested in communication and it lit a fire underneath you.
To be honest, I originally, in my teenage years, I was a very focused individual, and I wanted to be a production trainee for the BBC.
Okay.
For a long, long time. And so everything in my teenage years was geared towards that. So I did my work experience at the local newspaper. I was the local newspaper reporter for my school. I set that up. I joined the local hospital radio station. I was very, very shy. So that was, a big thing. And I ended up running it for 7 years. And it was all geared towards getting to the BBC. And I did a communication studies degree with the aim of getting to the BBC. And I literally got to the point where I had the application form for the BBC production trainee scheme in front of me. And I sat about to write it and thought, I don't want to do this. I hated the video module on my course. I was terrified of dropping the camera. I loved running the hospital radio station, but I didn't really enjoy doing the programs. Dare I say, I found them a little bit boring after a while. And I realized that what I really liked with people. So at that point, I fell into a job with a local hospice, actually. I was an appeal coordinator. I raised the money to buy the building, looked after all the volunteers. And then was looking around to see what to do after that. And a job just came up at Royal Mail at the time. And it was at the time called an ERIC, which stood for an Employee Relations Internal Communications Manager. And I really just liked the look of it because it was all about people. And I applied for it and I didn't get it because it was way out of my league, really. Actually, at that time, it was not on the graduate scheme. It was just the actual job. And then I saw the job advertised again on the graduate scheme, exactly the same job, £10,000 a year lower, which kind of brought it within my league. So I applied for it and got it. And I stayed in it ever since that point.
That's fantastic. So you did it a different way around to the way I understand most people get into communications is through journalism. You decided to skip that bit and go straight into a job as an Eric.
Yeah, I mean, internal communications is an interesting one because people come from all directions. It's not really been a profession for a long time. So you get people coming from HR, you get people coming from journalism. I guess you get more people coming into public relations from journalism. I mean, I've trained a lot of internal comms people and I meet a lot of them that say, I'm not really a proper comms person. I'm an engineer, or I'm a teacher, or I'm a whatever. And I quite like that because I think it brings this big melting pot. So in my profession, I am actually unusual in that I did a communication studies degree, went into communication when I was kind of 22 and stayed with it. Not many people in the older days, if you like, been doing it 25 years now, came that route.
Okay, that's interesting. And it shows what I know about how people get into communications. So you said that you hated the video module that you did. Why was that?
I'm not very good with technology. Probably going to find out my microphone's not working, or headphones.
I can hear you loud and clear.
That's good. I'm not very good with technology. Like I said, whenever I got this very, at the time, heavy camera on my shoulder, I was terrified I'd drop it or I'd point it at the sun or something like that. So there was the fact that I didn't really enjoy that. But then I think there was also the fact that what I'd realized I had enjoyed by that point was people. So when I was running the hospital radio station, I looked after about 40 volunteers. I always say I made all my leadership mistakes at that time because I was 17 when I started leading. I had no idea what I was doing. And I dealt with the management team that had like the chairman of the local health authority, chairman of the local Lions committee. I set up a news program with the editor of the local newspaper. And I just got used to dealing with lots and lots of people and looking after lots and lots of people. And that's what made me tick, really. That's what really interested me was people. So that's what's always kind of, I've gone towards, I suppose. And thinking back about my communication studies course, it wasn't really the kind of comm studies course you get these days, which are more practical and they're very, how do you plan a communications campaign? In those days, it was much more psychology. How do we think? How do we learn? How do we process information? How do we remember things? Sociology. And that's what interests me. I'm really fascinated by how do our brains work? Why do we do the things we do? How do we connect with each other? Why do we sometimes not connect with each other? That's what fascinates me. And that's what's always kind of kept me in this sphere, really.
Well, I'd love to come on and speak more about that in a moment. But before that, you just mentioned that you made a lot of mistakes at the hospice. What mistakes did you make and what did you learn?
Hospital radio, that was. What mistakes did I make? Gosh, loads. It's a long time ago. I probably avoided conflict rather than dealing with situations. And that meant sometimes that I was harder on people than I should have been because I just try and do something to get a situation out of the way rather than engaging with it and dealing with it. That's probably the biggest one. And I think when you go into it, especially being on a graduate scheme, I mean, the great thing about being on a graduate scheme is that you go into an organization and they instantly give you lots of training. So, that you instantly do get the training on how you should be managing people or leading people and the things to think about. I mean, goodness me, I made a lot of mistakes in those days as well. I think in my early years, the thing that I probably got wrong was about the distance that you keep between you and the people you work with. To what extent are you the far away boss person? To what extent do you think I'm not really a boss, I'm kind of just the same as you are? And how do you find the place in the middle? And I was too close to people, I think. I don't like putting myself on the pedestal and being the boss person. And I had to learn to probably put a bit more distance between us than was comfortable for me.
So how do you do that?
I had to learn to not share as much about myself. And the first time I learned that I'd done it wrong, if you like, was I'd actually moved on to, I was looking after 2 teams at the time. And somebody told me that somebody in my original team was having a really bad time. And I was like, no, she can't be. I'd know. You know, we get on really well. We talk about everything together. And then when I sat down with her and said, look, I've heard a few rumors, she was having a really bad time, but she knew I wasn't having a great time. And so she wanted to protect me. And I thought, no, hang on a minute, that's not the way it's supposed to work. So yeah, that for me, I felt like I should not give away, if you like, as much about myself, especially not great things that I was going through, if it meant that people then couldn't talk to me about what they were going through, if that makes sense. I made that mistake a few times in those early days.
It's interesting. How has that lesson transferred itself to the training that you give people now?
That's an interesting question. I suppose the training that I give people now, it asks you to do a lot more thinking before you communicate. I suppose in my early days, I did what we mostly do. You know, I just got in there and got on with it. Whereas these days, I try and teach people to think about, for example, at the end of this conversation, how do you want to leave the person at the end of it? You know, is there something you want them to do as a result of this conversation? How do you want to leave people feeling? What do you want them to know? And also the whole idea of thinking about your audience, you know, what state of mind do they like to be in when they come to this conversation? And no feel do, it's a really simple technique. You know, what do you want this person to know? How would you like them to feel? What would you like them to do? But I think it is such a useful technique. I'd actually, I'd gone to attend a training course myself about something entirely different, about animal communication, oddly enough. And in the break, I found this person talking to me about communication. She didn't know what I did. I hadn't talked about my job. And she was talking about the fact that she kept managing to really offend people in conversations. And she didn't know why, because she was just being honest. She was just being herself. And, you know, what was the problem with these people? And I spent about the first half of the break thinking, no, I'm not at work. I'm not about to try and teach this person something. And then finally, I kind of said, look, I actually, you know, I do teach communication. And I said, one thing that I find quite helpful is to think, you know, not only what do I want this person to know in this conversation, but actually, how would I like to leave them feeling? And she went very quiet. And then she said, I've never actually thought about how I wanted to leave people feeling. And she actually came up to me right at the end of the day and said, I just want to tell you that you made a big difference to me today. Because she just always thought, I'm just being honest. You know, I'm just saying what I want to say. And she hadn't thought about how is it leaving them feeling. And there was an organization also that I worked with a long time ago, one of the well-known fast food organizations, shall we say. And they had a program with very good intentions of getting senior leaders out into their fast food restaurants to see what it was like on the front line, you know, good thing to do, back to the floor kind of thing. But they found that what was happening was that these leaders were going into these fast food restaurants wanting to make a difference. So they were going in and going, oh, you know, you could solve this over here and you can make this better over there. And actually you're doing that wrong and we could put that right. And they were actually leaving people feeling demoralized because they went in with, here's 15 things that you could be doing better. And so they started to talk about when they left these restaurants, they wanted to, as they put it, leave people feeling whole. And I really liked that. So they were really saying to their leaders, don't just go in there trying to solve problems. It's about how do you want to leave people feeling when you leave. Don't leave them feeling like they're doing 10 things wrong. Leave them feeling whole. So yeah, things like, how do I want this person to feel at the end of the conversation? Very simple, but I think it's quite helpful.
It must have been really nice to have heard that you influenced that person so much in such a short space of time.
Yeah, it is nice. It's one of the things I've really liked about training, actually, because I designed a program for senior leaders in 3 parts, and in the third part of this particular program I designed, they came back to talk about something that they'd done as a result, and I really enjoyed that. I really enjoyed hearing, I did this and it made a difference. Yeah.
I've heard you talk a little bit about the way technology has improved the practice of communication, or internal communication maybe specifically. But you've said that it's a double-edged sword, in that it means that we don't really think enough about our communication until we press the send button. So how can we avoid being trigger happy in those circumstances?
For me, it's about the kind of things that I've just said, really. It's I think if you have just one or two simple techniques and you get into the habit of saying, before I communicate, I'm going to do this. So for me personally, for example, I will very rarely do anything, even write an email, without thinking to myself, what do I want people to know, feel, and do as a result of sending this email? Because otherwise I can waffle on forever and not really get anywhere. So, like I say, I mean, I'll usually, the kind of things that I'll take people through usually is that's the first one. You know, why do you want to communicate? Whether it's giving a presentation, having a conversation, writing an email, whatever it might be. Why is it you want to do this? What's the result you want to get from it? What are you hoping people will know, feel, and do? And then trying to kind of throw ourselves into the other person's position and saying, well, that's what you want, that's how you feel, but actually, how are they coming to this conversation? Because quite often, for example, we forget that people don't know as much as we know. And so we start the conversation from the wrong position. We make lots of assumptions. And then the third thing I tend to think about is what are maybe the 1 to 3 most important points you want to get across. I work with a lot of engineers who are brilliant people with amazingly big brains, and they like details. And I think when we give out lots of details, the main points can get lost. So I think as well, it's about that, making sure you've got those key points. I mean, I mentioned earlier that I'm very conflict averse. I still am. So if I have to have a difficult conversation, I write down for myself, for example, these are the 3 things that I've got to say. Even if I really, really, really don't want to say them, I'll have them in front of me and I'll make sure that I say them 3 times. And it helps me. Because otherwise I would just avoid saying it.
I can imagine somebody listening to that answer and saying, well, that's all very well, but I don't really know how to put myself in somebody else's shoes. What would you say to them?
How to put myself in somebody else's shoes? I guess it depends who it is. So maybe I can answer that easier if I give you an example. I'll give you an example of a leadership team that I worked with. And when I started this training for them, they opened it by saying, oh, you know, we're really looking forward to this training. We really need it because we're really bad at communication. And I said, oh, that's interesting. What makes you say that? And they told me that they were leading this big change program that they've been working on for a long time. And they just run this event about it. That they've been planning for a long, long time, 2-hour event. They really wanted to leave people feeling excited and engaged and fired up about this change. And they said, we just didn't manage it. You know, we maybe managed to get people a little bit aware, but that's about as far as we got. So we really needed to, you know, how do we really engage people more than that? And I said, how long have you been working on this change? And they said, 8 months, 9 months. And I said, and how much had you communicated about it before that event? And they said, we hadn't. And I said, okay, that's the first time these people had heard about it. And they said, yes. So I was like, okay, so you've had 8 months to get excited and work through this change. And you're just anticipating that these people after 2 hours will reach the same position as you're in. So I don't know if there's one answer to the question. I think sometimes it is about just trying to take that step back and saying, well, where are you and where are they? I sometimes give the analogy of a train, especially in a change scenario. So I say, if you're the one managing a change, imagine yourself as the driver of a train. You've got control of it. It's a very basic human need to have control. You've got an enormous train window right in front of your face. You can see where you're going. It's very obvious. And if you think about the train tracks as something like, we might know the change curve that talks about, you know, going through change and the emotions of change, you're further along that curve than anybody else. But if you think about the people affected by this change that you're about to communicate to, imagine that they're 10 carriages back on the train. So they haven't got any control. which feels uncomfortable to start with. And when you're looking out of that window in front of you and you're thinking, come on, this is obvious, they're 10 carriages back and they can only see sideways. So you've got to kind of put yourself in the 10th carriage, not communicate from the driver's seat, because they just can't see what you can see.
I absolutely love that analogy. It's fantastic. The curse of knowledge is a dangerous thing.
Yes. Have you ever tried that thing where you can tap out a song that to you is really obvious? I sometimes do it with Jingle Bells, and you're like, come on, it's obvious. And the other person doesn't get it. And you're like, come on, it's obvious, it's obvious, it's a really well-known song. And it's the curse of knowledge that you know what it is, but they haven't got a clue.
Okay, so let's take ourselves back to Royal Mail. You've arrived at Royal Mail as an Eric. That stuck in my brain for some reason, even though it was at 10 grand less than the job you originally applied for. What happened then?
Oh gosh, I loved the start of it. So the weird thing was I'd gone from a job at the local hospice where, you know, I spent my time going out to schools, you know, promoting great sunflower grows, meeting lots of people. People would come up to me in the supermarkets because they got to know me at their school, or they see me in the paper or whatever. And then I went into Royal Mail, where it was completely about the hierarchy. And even though I was, you know, on not the biggest wage, I was fairly high up in the management hierarchy. And I remember walking into my office and sitting at my desk, and a couple of days later, somebody came in and said, why are you sitting in your PA's chair? And I said, what are you talking about? I'm sitting in a chair. And they said, no, your chair's got arms. You know, you're allowed arms because you're the manager. And I remember going out one evening to have a look at what's called a TPO, travelling post office. It's like a train that carries the mail. And the training guy was introducing everybody, and he was like, oh, you know, here's this person, this is their job, here's this person, this is job. And he went all around the room, and then he said, and this is Sue, and she's a JV2. And that was my grade. And so he was basically saying to everybody in the room, and she's more senior than any of us, including us. And I found that so weird that people didn't mix. My cousin worked there as a postman. And in those days, the managers sat on one side of the canteen and the non-managers sat on the other side. And I went to sit with them at lunchtime. And he said, you can't sit here. And I said, what do you mean? Of course I can sit here. And he said, you're a manager, you've got to sit over there. And I said, I'm not sitting over there. And I used to make a point of going on to a shift every week. So I went out on the night shift. I used to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, go out to a different delivery office. And managers just did not do that. And people loved it. So the night shift, I remember it, they bought me a potted plant and they wrote me a letter just because managers didn't do that. And that's what I loved. You know, I said to you, I loved people. So it was known at the time, the area that I went into, to be quite a difficult area. There was a lot of strikes going on. We had the lowest employee opinion survey results in the country. And people would laugh at me and say, you know, it can't get any worse. I remember it did when I went in. Morale in distribution was 4%. And the week after I started, the new results came in at fallen to 2. Okay, it can get worse. But it meant the only way was up. You know, and the management team were really up for making a difference. And just those simple things of saying, don't be ridiculous. Of course, we can sit on the same side of the canteen, and I will go in on the night shift, and I will go in at 5 o'clock in the morning, made a difference. And I liked that. I liked connecting with people. So
how did you break down those barriers initially? And did you need to get buy-in from the people above you to do that?
I found it by happy accident. So very, very early on in the job, could have even been in my first week, they had long service awards there, and there was a long service award dinner that anybody, I think it was 30 or 40 years service, went to, and it had been organised before I got there by my predecessor. And so I went along, and I was sat in on the same table, I remember so well, as a 40-year guy called Jim, one of the drivers. And there was a band that night, and there was a disco, and the band were dire. I mean, they were absolutely diabolical. And I was like, right, I've got to get rid of the band. And I remember the head of processing was also on my table, and he was like, I'll do it, love. And I said, no, it's my job. I'll do it. So I just went and had a quiet word with the band in the break and said, look, I think there's been some kind of mistake, and sent them off home. And we just had the disco for the rest of the night. Thought nothing of it. Anyway, on Monday morning, when I went back to work, I walked down into the driver's cabin and there was Jim that had been on my table. And he kind of put his arm around me and said, see, this here young lady, this is our employee communications manager. And on Saturday night, she got up on the stage and she fired an entire orchestra, which was so not true. But having Jim behind me, who was, he was a 40-year guy, he was really well known amongst the drivers. And I learned very quickly that as long as I found those people that were, we'd now call them influencers, but in those days, it was just the people that were known and liked. And as long as I found them and engaged with them, that really helped. So there was a guy, for example, on the processing floor, one of the middle managers. He was a really popular guy. And it was a tiny thing. At the time, Royal Mail brought in shorts that could be worn. And I put a photograph on the front page of the magazine. And I'd got photographs of people in shorts. And I put this guy, Alan's head, on a pair of the shorts. And I said, by the way, Alan's wearing the ladies' version. And at the time, it was a conversation starter. And so I just found the popular people and had the conversations with them. And once they were on my side, everybody was on my side.
So how do you find the popular people in organisations nowadays? Because there are very few people who've been in organisations for 40 years that are still around now.
Well, I came across one organisation actually who had, there is a lot goes on now where people do identify influencers. And one they'd done that is every time, for example, they'd run a focus group or they'd gone to talk to people, they would ask questions like, who gets listened to around here? Or when you want to find out who's going on, who do you ask? And they just keep asking people, and eventually the same names start coming up. So that's certainly one way of doing it. You can also ask people to nominate people. If, for example, you want to find influencers, you can ask them to nominate people. But that's certainly one way. People know who are the people in their part of the organisation that get listened to or they go to for advice. So I think as soon as you get out of your office and actually get out there and start talking to people, they'll tell you. I've always, even in my earlier consultancy days, for example, if I've been out shooting videos or I've been out in the organisation for any reason, I've kept in touch with the people that I was with. And so if I wanted to know what was going on the ground, or I wanted an opinion, or I wanted to say, can I just check something with you, or can I test something, I can ring them up. And I've often found that they know what to do better than I do, very often.
So have there been any instances where you've found influencers and wanted to get them on board, but they've been very standoffish?
No, to be honest, because I suppose when I found influencers, it's because I've been out there and done something with them. So maybe if I give you another example, one example I'm thinking of, it was an organisation that had put in place it was a big systems integration. And it was horrible when it was happening. It was one of these things where it's implemented across lots of sites, and it means processes get changed, jobs are lost, numbers are reduced, people have to apply then for new jobs, new job restrictions are going in. Often when new systems go in, they don't work right to begin with, and people are having an awful time. And I was running some roadshows at the time, and I was in a focus group, and I said to people, what is it you want from these roadshows? And they said, we want to know what it's really like when these computer systems go in. So I went to the first site where it had gone in, and they were having a horrible time. And we shot a really honest video where I said to people, what's it like? And they told the truth. And they said, oh, it feels really nice in the training. And then when you get back to your desk, it's just horrific. It doesn't work. And we've got queues of people. And they were having a horrible time. And I used it in the roadshows, kind of sandwiched in an interview with the project manager saying, why is this happening? What are you doing about it? How is the system being improved? And I kept in touch with those people. And at that particular conference, we got kind of interactive voting. And one of the questions we asked people was, to what extent do you think this new system will make things better. It's right for the organisation. And people said, yes, they thought it was right for the organisation. And then we said, to what extent do you think it's right for our customers? And the kind of numbers dropped a little bit, but it was kind of, okay, it's going to be quicker for customers in the end. And then when we said, to what extent do you think it's right for you as employees? The numbers were through the floor. It was like, of course, it's not right for employees. And the MD at the time said to me, oh gosh, we've got to do something about that. We've got to help people see the benefits. And I said, well, what are they? And he said, oh, I don't know, more transparent career opportunities. And I said, oh, come on, pull the other one. And they said, I don't know. So I actually went back to that first site, and it was now 6 months later. And I spoke to those people that had been in the video, and I said, how are you getting on? How's the system? And they said, oh, it's great. Actually, now we've got used to it. We're having to use one set of files instead of 3. We haven't got the old green screens. And there were lots of things that now they've got used to it. It was great. And I said to them, what do I do? How do I help the rest of the organization understand this? And they said, you come back and you film us again, because everybody saw us being honest the first time. And so now if we say it's 6 months later and this is how it feels, or this is the advice we give to some people in our position, they'll believe us. So on the face of it, you would have said those people might have been standoffish because they were having a horrible time. But they weren't, because we went in and listened to them, and we did something about it. So to me, I think most people, if they're genuinely listened to and they can see that you genuinely have an intention to act in their interests, I think people respond to that.
Yeah, obviously you're correct. But I think...
I was waiting for the but, I could see it.
I think there are times where you have to give people some bad news about something. And I know that you've talked about this a little bit previously, and probably I haven't been through your training, so it must be something you talk about a lot in your training. You're someone who doesn't like conflict. You've said that a couple of times in this interview so far. How do you handle those situations where, it's all very well coming to people and kind of asking them to be honest, or you to be honest with them? How do you handle the scenario?
Well, let me talk about redundancies, because I guess that's the classic. I worked a lot with redundancies, and they're very hard. And at the same time, I used to quite like working with them, because I think you can make a difference to people. So I think they're a real moment of truth, where if they're handled badly, you can leave someone feeling lousy. I mean, my husband was made redundant, and I really wanted to march into that organisation and say, for goodness sake. At the same time, I mean, one of the organisations I've worked with used to be NTL, it's now Virgin Media. When I was there, we had a really bad time. We went through Chapter 11 bankruptcy, actually. So it was when the market really dropped. And we had to make thousands of redundancies very quickly sometimes. And I remember once we had to make a lot of redundancies just before Christmas. And I remember saying to the MD, oh no, let's just not do this just before Christmas. And he said, we've got no choice. He was a really, really good guy to work with. And I remember at the time, I used to look after his feedback account. He could see it and I could see it. And we had notes from people coming in saying things like, remember one in particular, she said, this is the hardest note I've ever had to write, because it's the last day I've had at the organisation. But she said, I want to say, it must be lonely up there, but I have to say that I think you've been fair, wise, and in control. And it said, I hope, what did it say? Something like, I hope you get the support from the people you care so much about. And I think it was, to me, it comes down to showing that you care. So in that situation, as I say, I mean, crikey, the British media was killing us. We had headlines like NTL, no time left. Is the NTL cable about to snap? And I remember at the time saying to my team, I want to know what people are worried about before they even know they're worried about it. And we would address it. We'd come out and say, look, we know this is what you're worried about. This is our answer on it. And the CEO I worked with at the time, really good guy called Stephen Carter, now Lord Stephen Carter. In fact, his favourite motto was, tell it as it is. And we did. So it didn't matter how hard the message was. People knew that we would tell it as it was, and we cared about what people thought. So I think there are always tiny things you can do that show that you care. I mean, if I go back to that organisation with the IT systems, for example, I remember we were putting that new computer system in, and there were 2 sites that we were closing completely. So they would never have that system because they'd be closed before it went in. And we'd made a video about this new system. And it's like, okay, we don't want to get these people to feel excluded because we are not showing it there because they won't even have it. But then again, we don't want people to feel like we're being completely insensitive because we make them watch a video of a system that they won't get. So for those particular sites, we just recorded an extra 20 seconds at the start of their videos that said, look, we've thought really carefully about the position you're in here. And exactly the same thing that I've just said to you. We don't want you to be in this position, but we don't want you to be in this position. So here's the video. And if you would like to watch it, we're giving you the time now and you can sit and watch it. If you would rather not watch it, that's fine too. Go and have a coffee. But it was really just trying to show people that we've thought about you. And I quite often say at times of change, you get points for showing your workings out. We could have agonized about that for ages and then said, let's do it this way because we think it's the best way. And whichever way we'd chosen would have been wrong for some people for whatever reason. But because we've said we thought about this really carefully, we could have done it this way, and this is the reasons that would be good or bad. We could have done it this way, and so this is what we've decided. I think at least that way people can see that you cared and you've thought about them.
Yeah, I have a similar but very different experience in that, I coached rowing for a long time. People don't have a social life because they train to row. All the people that I coached none of them were professionals, all amateurs. So they're working, in finance or law or whatever it is in London. I mostly coach in London. And then they're spending all of their time outside of their paid work training to win rowing events. And when it comes down to selection time, as a coach, you're almost playing with people's dreams. People are incredibly passionate about the sport and want to do really well. And it's even gone to just coaching people out on the water. There was a time when people said to me, well, why don't you give people sandwich feedback? Good thing, bad thing, good thing.
Yeah.
But all they remember is the good thing, right? So why not just give it to them straight? And the same with coming down to selection. You didn't make the boat because of this, and then just leave it, rather than you didn't meet the boat because of this, but you did a really good job otherwise. And that, it bullshits them. It's interesting handling that.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting what you say about not weasel words, but almost not wanting to say the bad thing. I mean, there was a company I worked with, which shall remain nameless, that didn't want to use the word redundancy or job loss because they thought they were nasty words. So no, in all our communications, and this is the first time around, we had to talk about jobs falling away. So, it would say, and at this point in time, your job will fall away, which I thought was ridiculous. And then the next,
like a leaf from a deciduous tree.
Exactly. And then it got worse. So the next round, it was like, okay, yeah, no, we don't really like fall away. We still don't want to talk about redundancies or job losses, though. So we had to use the word disappear. And I used to have visions in my head of, until this date, your job's done, and then poof, all of a sudden it will disappear. And it was ridiculous. And it was because we didn't want to say the bad words.
You've been disappeared has a different connotation in other circumstances, doesn't it?
Yes. So ridiculous.
Thanks for sharing that story with me. It's one you've shared before, but I think it was really nicely and slightly differently told this time. So thank you. I'd like to get on to the topic of stories, because you've told quite a few stories during this interview so far, and you're a good storyteller. You obviously enjoy them. I've heard you tell the story, and I believe you tell the story in your training about the stonemasons. So firstly, can you retell the story for us?
Yes. So the story goes that there was a traveller going for a walk, let's say, and they happened upon 3 stonemasons, all doing basically the same job, lugging around heavy lumps of stone. And the person went up to the first stonemason and said, "What are you doing?" And the first stonemason said, you can see what I'm doing. I'm, lugging around this really heavy stone. I'm going to spend all day chipping away at it. And it's blooming hard work and it's a hot day. And this person went to the second stonemason who's doing exactly the same job and said, what are you doing? And the second stonemason said, oh, I'm helping to build a wall. And then they went to the third stonemason, again, who's doing exactly the same job, and said, what are you doing? And the second stonemason looked a bit happier than the other two and said, oh, I'm helping to build a really great cathedral. So three people doing the same job, but very different ways of talking about it.
And in what context do you tell that story?
I tend to use it to talk about meaning or purpose. So, how do we help people find meaning in their job? And sometimes it's not the job itself. It's how we help people attach meaning to that job, how we connect it to a bigger purpose.
Obviously, you think stories are important for communicators to communicate. Can you give me an example where you've used that to really good effect in your work for NTL or Royal Mail or Barclays, whichever you want to pick?
I use stories then. Yes. So do you mean the stonemason stories or just stories in general?
Stories in general.
Stories in general. So I'm going to go back to redundancies, actually. So I'm going to take you back to what was then NTL, and we had to close a lot of our call centres. And we could have gone about that in a few different ways. We could have done death by 1,000 cuts. So we could have just closed one and then closed one and then closed one and never said, here's the big picture. Or we could have taken the risk that we might lose people and tell them, be truthful, give them the whole picture and say, look, we've got however many call centres, let's say 13, we're only going to have 3. And we take the risk that in telling people that, we lose everyone because it's going to take 24 months to close them. We decided to take that risk because we thought it was the honest thing to do. But what do we do to mitigate that? First of all, we said to people, look, we're going to give you, this is lots of notice. These are all the timescales you'll have. You'll have lots and lots of time before your particular site closes. But the other thing we did is we used stories. So the very first call centre that we closed, I have to say that the support that people got on site there was blooming fantastic. I mean, they got local employers in giving talks. They really did so much to help people in that place get new jobs. And at the time, I sent somebody from my team down to the call centre and I said, find me some people, find their stories. And I remember it was Wendy and my team coming back and saying, God, I can't believe how upbeat people are there. And she'd captured people's stories. And there was one woman, for example, that had said, well, I've always wanted to be a teacher. And this has given me the impetus that I've needed. There was somebody else that talked about the fact that the organisation was actually supporting them to move to a different part of the country. There was somebody else that talked about, the fact that they'd managed to get another job in the local community because the site brought somebody in for the interviews. And we used these stories to say to people in the other call centres that would be losing their jobs, look, when it comes to your turn, this is the support that you will get. Because quite often people won't believe, for example, the organisation or a senior representative of that organisation, but they'll believe someone like me. So if we can get them a story from someone like me that says, this is what it's been like, and we can say, here you go, that really helped us.
It's interesting that you brought up meaning within organisations. It's my belief that telling stories is key to bringing meaning to and purpose to our work and the things we do. So, for example, I told many stories to my athletes, bored them to tears probably. And I felt that not only did it convey good information or good lessons I wanted to teach them, it bonded everyone together. It created meaning within the group. Is that where you were going with your stonemason story and how you would advocate providing or building meaning within organisations?
Yes, with the stonemason story, yes. And there is actually, I can't think of the name of the people that have done it, but there was some really interesting research I read recently about purpose and meaning, how people found meaning in their work. And they found that it wasn't that, for example, people went about their work every day thinking, oh, this is really meaningful job, or they found meaning because they had a great line manager, or they had I don't know, a great system, or that, you know, the company gave out free donuts on a Friday. They realized how meaningful their jobs were when, for example, you got people together and you said to them, tell me about, you know, a time in the last month when you've really found your work meaningful. And it made them sit down and say, oh, actually, yes, this happened. And they would tell a story of something that had happened in their job. The other thing that made a difference, they found in this research, is if they got people who had been impacted by that work to come in and tell their stories. So if they got a customer to come in, for example, and say, this is the difference that your work made to me, that made a difference, that story made a difference. So I found that quite interesting, the fact that they said work didn't become meaningful for people until they told their stories, or until they heard a story, because that's kind of when they noticed it, if you like. I found that quite interesting.
You've done a bit of study of behavioural science. Have you delved into any of the stuff about flow and participatory knowing?
Flow, I only know about because I did a master's in positive psychology. So I remember we had to learn how to spell Csikszentmihalyi. They did all the stuff around flow. But no, I haven't come across this. You tell me, what
people find meaningful is the participation in things and the knowing they get from that. So you act and you get feedback from the thing you're acting on. You adjust your action, you act again, and you get more feedback. So that kind of cyclical event. And I'm probably putting a line through, you know, many scientific papers, but flow is about that or participatory knowing and acting and getting feedback like that is what flow basically is. And flow is about the pattern matching in those situations where you can adjust what you're doing. So I think those stories allow people to reflect on what they're doing and what feedback they're getting from the stuff that they're doing that allows them to change, because every story goes through a change, you know, the typical hero's journey.
Yes. And I think what's interesting actually is the extent to which those conversations are enabled. So I ran another session where it was leaders again. I got them to bring in a picture. I got each of them to say, bring me a picture that shows me what inspires you about your job. And they brought in all kinds of pictures. So one person brought in a picture of the brand, you know, the actual logo, and said, I get inspired because I work with this big global brand and everybody knows what it is. And I can say that I work here. Somebody else, because they made construction equipment, tractors and things, and he brought in a little model, a picture of a tractor, and he said, I loved these as a kid and now I get to work with them. And everybody brought in this picture that had a story behind it. And then at the end of it, somebody said to the group, you know, we never have these conversations in our teams. If we talk about what we've achieved in the year, for example, we might say, oh yeah, we managed to meet our target of operational excellence, or, you know, reducing costs by 2% or whatever. But we don't have these conversations about, but what have we done that's been meaningful, or it's inspired us, or it's made a difference? And it's those conversations that have an emotional connection, not just that corporate factual stuff around achieving targets and cost reduction and blah, blah.
I've noticed you use quite a few analogies and metaphors as well. Is that a conscious thing? Is that something you use regularly in your work?
I do. I don't think I'm conscious of it, but yes, if I'm teaching communication with leaders, for example, I will talk about using metaphors, because we know the brain likes to match patterns, and that's how metaphors work, by sometimes taking, for example, a complex subject that's hard to get your head around and matching it to something that we do know about. So one book I loved, for example, when I was doing my master's in positive psychology, and we had a syllabus about neuropsychology, which I found really difficult because of all the terms of the brain. You know, I just couldn't remember them. And I had this book, trying to look on my bookshelves, I think it was called Brain Rules. And I loved it because all the way through, he would take the parts of the brain and he would say, now this part of the brain is like this. So I remember at one point, for example, he said, now cells they're a bit like fried egg. So, this part of a cell is like the white, and then you've got the nucleus, that's like the yolk. And I remember he talked about the hippocampus, and he said, oh, it's a bit like central station, because this is where, all the signals come in, and then they all get sent out. And suddenly the brain went from all these random terms that I couldn't remember to, oh yeah, that's a bit like a fried egg, that's a bit like central station. So I think they're very good for making the complex simple. I think they can also be very good for helping people talk about things that they might find difficult. So I went into one organization with a group of very senior leaders who were going through change, engineers. And as one of them said to me at the time, they didn't do emotion, they were engineers. So if I tried to start a conversation about how do you feel about the change, I was getting nowhere. But at the time, their chief exec had written a note out about the change, got into the papers actually, not for good reasons. And he talked about standing on the burning platform, that well-known metaphor of change, which I suggest is not always the best one to use. But anyway, he talked about standing on the burning platform. And when I started this workshop, I said, where are you in relation to the burning platform? And people would say, for example, well, I've jumped, but my team are still on the ledge and I don't know how to get them down. Or I've jumped, but there's flames all around me in the water and it's smoky and I don't know how to get anywhere else. So I couldn't get them to talk about this is how I feel about the change, but I could give them a metaphor and they would talk to me about exactly the same thing in terms of the metaphor.
I'd like to move on to your interest in behavioural science. Where did that stem from?
Well, I think it probably stemmed from the fact that I've been interested in psychology for a long time. And then I went on to positive psychology because I wanted to study something about psychology, but I wasn't really interested in illness. So then I discovered positive psychology, which is the psychology of, they always say, if kind of, traditional psychology is about how do you get from -10 to 0. Positive psychology says, well, feeling okay is one thing, but how do you get from 0 to +10? So I went from there to there. And then I must have just come across behavioural science, really. And the more that I've read, the more that I find it really quite fascinating, because again, it's about our brain and how does it work? And I find all of that fascinating.
What is it you find fascinating about it? And how has that helped you with the work that you do?
I find it the question of why do people do the things they do interesting. And I think in communication, the assumption for a long, long time has been, as in what we, traditional economics, we assume that human beings are rational. And as long as you give somebody a rational information about some, explanation of something, for example, this is why this change needs to happen, and this is what you need to do about it, they'll do it and they'll understand it because, you've just given them the logical, rational case. Whereas behavioural science says, well, it actually is where it says we're predictably irrational. So not only are we not rational, we're kind of irrational in fairly predictable ways. And so to me, it kind of gives you different avenues to explore, because it says, well, just telling people most of the time isn't going to work. You've got to think about what will influence. And there's a nice, have you come across the COM-B model?
No.
The B stands for behaviour, the C stands for capability, the O stands for opportunity, and the M stands for motivation. And it basically says to get people to change their behaviour, they need to have capability, opportunity, and motivation. So there are lots and lots of things that make up those things. But for example, capability might include, I know what you want me to do. I know how to do it. I've got the skills to do it. Motivation might be, I'd quite like to do it. It fits in with my values. I don't know, I had a customer with this problem just last week and I'd like to have helped them. An opportunity is my environment enables me to do that. So, when I interviewed somebody recently who was talking about the pandemic and was talking about PPE, and was saying that early on in the pandemic, some work had been done about how do we get doctors and nurses to wear face masks. And there was all kind of works around, is it to do with being, the whole capability thing? Do they know that they should wear them? Do they know how to wear them? Is it about motivation? Do we have to kind of get them to realize that it's the right thing to do? And it came down to the fact that, no, it's opportunity. They haven't actually got any PPE, so they can't wear it. So it's kind of quite a nice model. And as a communicator, it says, well, you can help two of those things through communication. You can influence capability because you can help with what people know or understand. You can influence motivation because you can influence emotions, but you can't fix opportunity with communication. So you can do the best communication in the world, but if, for example, somebody hasn't got the tools to do the job, you can communicate as much as you like, but you can't get them to do it. I quite like that.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up PPE. My sister is an infectious diseases doctor. She works in West London and saw some of the very first COVID patients to the UK. But she told this story of very early on, one of the nurses who had a mask on was in the ward or the room with people who had COVID, and every time the nurse would speak to one of the other doctors, she would move the mask down, speak, and then put it back up again. It's just, we've come a long way since then, fortunately.
We have. That tells you, this same guy, this behavioural scientist, made a point about face masks, actually, because he said, for example, if you're dealing with capability, which is about what people know, he said you've got to get the basic message right. And he gave the example of, you can give a message that says wear a face mask, or you can give a message that says cover your nose and mouth and don't, and keep it there. And he said they're very, very different messages, to your point.
You started your own training business for communicators and leaders after you left being in-house with several major organizations. What did you learn from that experience of not just having to communicate with other people, but teaching them?
It's interesting, actually, because when I first started, or for quite a while, actually, I used to get terrified when there was any what I would think of as a proper training person in the room, because I, for a long time thought, I'm not a proper training person, I'm just a comms person doing training. And I said to somebody once, one of these training people at the coffee time, I confided, and I thought, oh God, I get really nervous when there's somebody like you in the room because I'm not really a proper trainer. And he said to me, well, we're both in the same business. It's exactly the same thing. We're all trying to influence behaviors and connect with people. There's no difference. And I thought that was a really interesting point, actually, and probably a very good and proper point.
So switching gears entirely, mental health is, well, it's something that is in the media an awful lot at the moment, and it's in the media that people should be talking more about mental health within businesses. How do you think people should be speaking about that within their organizations?
I think what we see is leaders being open about things they've struggled with. I think the pandemic actually has made it easier to do that, because we've gone from people seeing their leaders, in suits, in boardrooms, or not very often, to seeing them like this, in their own homes behind a Zoom camera with the kids running into the room or the cat in the background. So leaders have become more human. And I think it's been easy for them to talk about situations they found difficult, again, in the pandemic, actually, because the things that their team members have been struggling with, they've probably been struggling with themselves. So it's kind of it's a conversation you can have to connect with. I think the other thing we see in organizations, it's stories again, isn't it? It's encouraging people to share their stories. And if I hear one person tell their story and I think, actually, that's quite like me, and I hear the story, and then I'm in a group of people where we talk about that story that I've just heard, it's easier for me to say, actually, that's something that I struggle with as well. And then probably somebody else in the room says it's something that I struggle with as well. So I think, one is leaders sharing their stories, and the other, I think it does come down to stories and then enabling conversations to start around those stories.
So you've told an awful lot of very positive stories during this interview. And I can imagine somebody listening to this going, well, everything that Sue has done in her career has been absolutely fantastic. What do you say to that person?
Oh gosh, I think every single thing I've done, I've looked at afterwards and thought, here's 10 ways I could have done that better or differently. And, I've worked in communication, as you've heard, just about all my life. And still, I genuinely never look at a situation and think, oh yeah, I know how to do that. Because I don't, because every situation is different. The environment's different, the people are different, society's changing so much now. I think I've always done, and I think we can all only ever do, trying my best to think about, what am I trying to do here? Let me try and put myself in that person's shoes, or those people's shoes. What do they care about? What are they worried about? What do they need to hear? And I think you do the best you can. You try and get some feedback. You look at what you've messed up or what you could have done better, and then you go and try and address it. Every single thing I've done, I could have done better.
And that's an incredibly self-aware way of thinking about things. But that you say that every situation you've come across is completely different. But clearly you're an absolute expert in what you do. You wrote the book on internal communications. And my knowledge of expertise is that experts are able to match patterns and see, using a chess analogy, chess masters can see many more patterns and many more scenarios than a novice or even an expert player can see. So there must be things within each of those situations, although they're completely different, where you can kind of pick up 1, 2, 3, 4 things and go, okay, well, I know where that's heading, so we can move it in this direction.
There are, and I think it's a yes and. So there are very simple, basic things I've got in my kit bag. So people sometimes say to me, for example, they'll do my training in leadership communication, and then they say, what's the advanced version? And I say, there isn't one. If you tell me you're doing these basic things really well, then your communication should be working, because they're simple in theory, but actually getting them right is really difficult. So I've genuinely got my very basic kit bag of, know, feel, do, trying to put myself in the audience's shoes, getting my messages, trying to think about, for example, telling my stories, using metaphors, maybe, using images. I've got all that stuff. But then I remember somebody saying to me, because I also train people to train, and I remember this one person saying to me, a bit like you just have, but she said, but see, you always know what to do, always in a training room. And she was trying to give me she was trying to get me to give her an answer to, if this happens, what do I do? If this happens, what do I do? If this happens, what do I do? And I said, I don't know. And she said, but you always know. And I said, no, I've just got more comfortable with not knowing, and knowing that I've kind of got my kit bag. And then I'm going to be open to whatever happens in that room in that moment with that group of people. And I'm going to be a bit more comfortable than I used to be with thinking, well, I've never met that before, and doing my best. I've still, after many years, had situations in training rooms that I thought, I have no idea what to do here. I went into a situation in Finland, I remember, where it was that group of senior leaders going through a lot of change. And boy, they were angry. And I got to a point, I think, about just before lunch. And I remember thinking to myself, okay, the wheels have been wobbling on this for a while, and now they've just fallen off. And I just sat down on my chair in the middle of the room and said, okay, this is not working, is it? What do you want to do? And somebody fairly aggressively back said, well, you're the trainer. What do you want to do? And I said, well, I know what I want to do, but you don't seem to like it very much. So that's why I'm asking. And we had this kind of conversation. And in the end, one of them said, well, I think we should carry on with what you want to do. And I said, is that what everybody thinks? And they said, yes. And I said, right then. And I stood up and I carried on. And my co-facilitator at the end of it afterwards said to me, I think that was at the end of my capabilities. How the heck did you know what to do? And I said, I had no idea what to do. I was completely terrified. I just lost the entire room, but I just thought, well, I can't stand here and carry on. I've got to do something. So I did something.
That's quite something to do, though, for somebody who doesn't like conflict.
I don't like conflict. I don't like it. I didn't like that situation. And at the same time, I think in the hardest times, you've just got to be authentic, haven't you? You've just got to kind of name the situation and say what needs to be said. I mean, yes, I could have carried on, but it was painfully horrible carrying on as it was.
Yeah. Putting a label on it is half the battle, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I love that you said that, you know, your kit bag is just full of really simple things. One thing I didn't ask you about was animal communication. Where did you go with that, and why did you do it?
I didn't do much with it in the end. Well, no, I actually went out to South Africa. I went out and did 5 days in South Africa with a woman called Anna Breitenbach.
Okay.
She had a really kind of famous thing on YouTube where she talked to a Black Panther, and I had 5 days in one of the safari parks in South Africa with a tracker and Anna Breitenbach and doing animal communication, which is fascinating. At the time, I found it really hard to do anything with it because you've really got to be able to quieten your mind. And it's kind of like shutting down that logical side and letting the other side happen. And at the time I was in the corporate world and I found it too difficult to stop my corporateness coming along and getting in the way and going and not really hearing that. So haven't really done anything with it, but it was fascinating and inspiring to learn about it at the time.
It sounds really interesting. I dived in a little bit to animal communication as well because so as a rowing coach, because as I said to you, my only method of communication on the water is my voice and my language, because I'm in a motorboat separate to the rowing boat, you know, so there's always several meters at least, and sometimes there's 4 miles between coach and athletes. So they're tied into their boat via their feet, so they can't really move. They're not supposed to move their head from looking forwards because doing that sets the boat off balance. So they can't look at me. I can't demonstrate because I'm in a different boat and I'm separated from them by distance, physically a barrier. So how do I get them to understand that they are doing the thing that I want, or they're not doing the thing that I want? So there's a book by a guy called Dave Aldred, and he mentioned this lady who was a dolphin trainer, whose name I'm not very good with names. He said that he learnt her method of shaping the way that her dolphins performed an action that they wanted. And so I thought, okay, fine, well, I'll get her book. And she's written several. One's about dolphin training, but another is about training dogs. The dog training one is about clicker training. And it's operant conditioning. I don't know whether you came across that in your... So I had a whistle, and whenever my athletes did the thing I wanted them to do, they got a whistle. The fascinating thing was that the first time I did it, I just saw a light bulb go off.
Really?
It was really weird. It worked incredibly well, but it was interesting also to hear what you said about you needing to quiet your mind, because doing the whistle training, or whatever you want to call it, with my athletes took an awful lot of concentration. And if you've not marked the thing in the split second as the thing that you want to happen, then you might as well have forgotten that you've given the whistle, because you've given the whistle for a different behavior.
Yes.
Yeah. And whilst you're trying to drive a motorboat, looking where you're going, looking for hazards around you, and watching somebody and trying to whistle at the same time was really difficult. But I did manage it, and it was really effective.
Oh, good for you. Because I've tried to learn a bit about the like you said, the behavior stuff because of cats, and the whole thing about kind of bad behavior, really. I mean, we've had a couple of cats that struggle with peeing and spraying around the place, and as you said, having to get them in that split second, and the fact that afterwards it's too late, and trying to say say to my husband, don't shout at them, they've forgotten, it's too late, it's you've got to get them at that point to do something else. And it's kind of, well, it's like so many things in life, isn't it? It's a simple principle, but it's really hard to do it.
It is. But if you can do it, I haven't managed to do it with any animals because there were no animals in my life. But from what I understand, it is incredibly effective. Okay, so why don't you tell me a little bit now about your book, which is soon to be released in its newest edition?
Yes. So the book is called Successful Employee Communications. It's aimed at people who work professionally with employee communications, or they've got a really pretty serious interest in it. And it takes you through the whole shebang, really, from why are we doing this whole thing? How do you get value from internal communications, to how do you audit your internal communications, through the whole communication planning thing. So the kind of things we just mentioned about how do you work out what you want to achieve, who your audience is, what the message is, what's the right channel, how do you measure it. Talks about change in behavioural science, talks about purpose, got the 3 stonemasons in there in the purpose chapter. Listening is a new chapter this time. yeah. So yeah, it's got lots and lots of case studies. It's a mix of, I'd say, theory, case studies, and trying to bring the two together.
Why don't you just leave us with a final thought? What was the most enjoyable time you had as an internal communicator?
The most enjoyable times I've had have been through leaders. So I mentioned Stephen Carter that I worked with at NTL. In a way, it was a horrible time because we went through all sorts of completely rubbish stuff. But he was a brilliant leader to work with. I think in large organizations where you've got that partnership between, the senior leader and the internal comms person, and being able to work with a leader whose motto was tell it as it is, who genuinely cared about what people thought, who valued my opinion, who trusted my opinion, and it was a partnership between us. That was brilliant. And I've always said since then, I don't really care about organizations that I work with, as in there are types of organizations I won't work with on ethical grounds, but otherwise for me, it's not about I want to work in that industry, I want to work in this industry. It's about I want to work with a leader like that because it makes all the difference.
That's a great place to leave it. Sue, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you for asking me.